I'd like to thank my honourable friend, the Minister, for the statement that he issued on April the 8th, condemning the attacks on Camp Ashraf. But I should say to my honourable friend, the Minister, that I am appalled by what I regard as a conspiracy of silence on this issue. I am at a complete loss to understand why the British Broadcasting Corporation and other matters have not reported on this issue at all. I find it deeply disappointing and very insulting indeed to the relatives of those who have been injured in the recent attack on Camp Ashraf. Now, my honourable friend in the House will be aware that on the 8th of April 2011, 2,500 Iraqi armed forces, following direct orders from Nuri al-Maliki and at the behest of the Iranian regime, using 140 armoured vehicles, carried out a vicious assault on Camp Ashraf, home to 3,500 Iranian dissidents, members of the People's Mujahideen Organisation of Iran, including 1,000 women. Now, I want to take this opportunity, Mr. Scott, to add my voice to the international condemnation of this absolutely brutalist, callous attack, a military assault against defenceless, unarmed civilians, which led to the death of at least 35 residents, including 8 women. The majority of them were in their 20s, and a further 350 were wounded. Of the 35 killed, Mr. Scott, 32 were shot in the head, chest or abdomen. 3 others were deliberately run over by Humvees and other military vehicles. At least 225 of the 350 injured suffered gunshots by the Iraqi forces. Now, the April the 8th attack is not over. Iraqi forces are now amassing inside the camp, and several Iraqi engineering battalions have completed a 6-kilometre-long embankment on the northern edge of Camp Ashraf's main road. Malcolm Smart, who is the director of Amnesty International's Middle East and North Africa programme, has stated that given the nature and scope of these new military installations, we're very concerned what Iraqi security forces may now be planning. So I strongly urge the government to convey the demands, which I will include in this speech, to the Iraqi government and its armed forces to stop any form of violence now, to stop aggression and attacks, especially using live ammunition against these civilised, unarmed refugees, and further to immediately withdraw all of its armed forces from Camp Ashraf.
Friend give way. Can I thank my honourable friend for giving way? Does my honourable friend believe, as I do, that the Iraqis simply cannot now be trusted to be taken at their word to uphold human rights in Camp Ashraf, and that the government not only needs to act, but should act under international law as we now know it?
Well, I absolutely agree with my honourable friend, and I would go further to say that I am very, very disappointed with the American government's role in all this matter. I am very, very puzzled about a number of issues which I will come to shortly in my speech, but I agree with my honourable friend on the point which he made. I must emphasise that the Ashraf residents have been residing in the camp for 25 years and have built a desert patch into a small town using their own resources and money. The receipts for all the expenses still exist. Now, as far as the Iraqi government's position on the attack is concerned, Iraqi officials claimed that only 3 residents had been killed and no live ammunition was used during the attack. However, I would refer the House to the numerous footages posted on the YouTube website and aired by international television stations, which clearly show Iraqi forces indiscriminately shooting at and running over unarmed residents. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, in a statement condemning the attack, further confirmed that of the 34 killed, and I quote, most were shot and some appear to have been crushed to death, presumably by vehicles. Simply put, an unarmed civilian population was slaughtered to death. And I will be giving my honourable friend the Minister evidence, photographic evidence of those who've been injured in this disgraceful attack. The Law Society's Human Rights Committee confirmed in a statement condemning the attack that in footage of the attacks, Iraqi security forces are actually seen opening fire on unarmed residents while others are ploughed down by heavy military vehicles. The United States of America State Department, in a statement on the 8th of April, said, "This crisis and the loss of life was initiated by the government of Iraq and the Iraqi military." Well, that's all well and good, Mr. Scott. But what are they doing about it? And why was there no assistance given by the hospital, which could have tended all these injured people? I also want to remind the House that when the Iraqi government took over protection of the camp in January 2009, United States officials publicly said that Iraq had given a written assurance to treat the residents humanely and in accordance with Iraq's constitution, laws and international obligations. So again to the House, there is the evidence of the people being killed and injured, but what is the United States government actually doing about it? Sir.
Is the honourable member aware if our own government, the United Kingdom government, has made any representations to the United States, ever mindful of the fact that we as a coalition, United Kingdom and USA, fought the battles in Iraq together? Is it not now an occasion for them to do something more constructive? And has our government made any representations to the USA?
Now, the honourable member makes an extremely good point, because although I've said umpteen times now that I very much regret voting for the war with Iraq, the honourable member is quite right. It was the United States of America who encouraged Britain to get involved in this. And I do hope that my honourable friend the Minister, when he replies, will give some sort of indication as to what pressure is being placed upon the United States government to help. This attack is the second time that the Iraqi government has resorted to using live ammunition and violence in a brutal attack on defenceless and unarmed residents. And I should point out that on the 20th of April...
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way, and of course I also share very much his sense of appall and horror at the activities that are going on in Ashraf. I'm hearing all sorts of horror stories that actually a terrible offence against crimes against humanity. But I'm also concerned, and I wondered if the honourable gentleman might be coming to this. I apologise if he is, but I'm very, very concerned about the treatment of the wounded. Already the ones that are wounded, sick and injured, because it's another example of inhumanity to neglect people who are sick. Wounded can be non-participant anyway, in any shape or form, and I find that appalling. And I wondered if I've no doubt that the honourable gentleman does have this in mind, but I don't want the opportunity to go by and not raise it.
Well, the honourable member I know to be a good, compassionate man, and he is absolutely right that as a result of the lack of treatment of these injured, already a further person has died, and I understand that there are some further difficulties in seeking adequate treatment, and I will come to that in a moment. So on the 20th of April 2009, the Iraqi Interior Ministry signed a statement confirming that Camp Ashraf was searched with police dogs of the Interior Ministry and no explosives or any weapons were found. And I actually have a copy of the document that I will be handing to my honourable friend, the Minister. Therefore, it is crystal clear that the Iraqi government neither has the intention or capability to protect Ashraf residents. It is far too weak a government with many Iranian proxies in their ranks. At the end of the day, they are not reliable for providing proper protection for the residents in accordance with international law, and it would be very naive for anyone to claim otherwise. Therefore, on behalf, Mr Scott, of the majority of backbench members of Parliament, and on behalf of 200 members of the other place, I very much urge our government to call on the United Nations to take the responsibility of providing protection for the camp and ensure that the rights of the residents are not violated, and further that it station a permanent monitoring team at the camp. In order to avoid any further loss of life or violent attacks, the Iraqi government, I think, should immediately withdraw its armed forces from the camp, which is an unarmed civilian zone. I also want to point out, Mr Scott, that the Iraqi government has often justified its totally unacceptable treatment of the camp residents under the pretext of imposing their sovereignty as a government. But let me state quite clearly that the residents have respected Iraq's sovereignty. Ashraf has been their home for 25 years. All the photos and films exist, and it is well documented and a well-known fact. Furthermore, this sovereignty in no way can allow Iraq to breach international law and breach the residents' fundamental rights under international human rights laws and the Genevan Conventions. I have a copy of the protected person's status card of one of the residents, which was issued by the multinational force in 2004, which states on it that until their final disposition, they are recognised as protected persons. Now, Senator John Kerry, Chairman of the United States Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, in a statement condemning the attack, described the attack as a massacre. And a massacre is exactly what this was: the cold-blooded murder of defenceless civilians by Iraq's military. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights has demanded, in relation to the attack, that there must be a full, independent and transparent inquiry, and any person found responsible for use of excessive force should be prosecuted. So, I demand that an international fact-finding mission, rather than one formed by Iraq, which was responsible for the brutal attack, be formed to carry out this task by the UN, so that the perpetrators of this crime against humanity, who ordered and carried out the killing of unarmed civilians, are brought before international courts and face justice. I have a list of 11 critically wounded Ashraf residents, which the honourable member has alluded to earlier, who could lose their lives, and I will provide my honourable friend the Minister with this list, and a copy of my speech, and indeed a DVD of the attack. And I ask and hope that my honourable friend takes action on the demands that we have raised today. And before concluding, Mr Scott, with the four points that I hope my honourable friend will raise, I know that our honourable friend, another Foreign Office Minister, has responsibility for our relationships with the UN, and I hope to be giving him some details that following the massacre in Rwanda, when the international community regretted doing nothing to stop it, in a World Summit in 2005, it was ratified that any sovereign state has a responsibility to protect the population in its territory, and if there are any signs showing that a crime against humanity, genocide or war crime is about to happen, every United Nations member state has a duty to intervene to stop it, and if it does, this will not violate the sovereignty of that government, but rather this will be a support for that state to realise its responsibility to protect its population and to fulfil that responsibility. So in view of that fact, that massacre has already occurred in Camp Ashraf, and indeed there are every signs that the Iraqi government has not fulfilled its commitments towards Ashraf residents, and instead it has launched their massacre and has so far killed 35 of them and wounded hundreds of them. So I will be drawing that to our honourable friend's attention a little later. So the 4 points that I wish my honourable friend to reflect on are, first of all, that our government demand of the United Nations that they take responsibility for providing proper protection for Camp Ashraf and to set up a permanent team in the camp. Secondly, the government should also demand that Iraqi forces immediately leave the camp and halt all further such attacks and aggression. Thirdly, I hope that the United Nations would form an international investigative mission for the perpetrators of this crime to face justice. And finally, that the United States of America urgently provide medical assistance to the many people who are injured. So I urge my honourable friend and the government to forward these basic demands at the highest level within the United Nations, European Union, and to my honourable friends opposite numbers in the United States administration. I know, Mr. Scott, that there is overwhelming support in the House of Commons and in the other place for the residents of Camp Ashraf to be protected. And I cannot understand why it is that there is such little reporting of this on TV, on our radio stations, and in the newspapers. Why, oh why, is there this conspiracy of silence? As far as international jurisdiction is concerned, right is entirely with these poor people in Camp Ashraf. Following my honourable friend's statement on the 8th of April, I know that I can rely on him to do the right thing and to ensure that the injured and wounded in Camp Ashraf are dealt with and that permanent protection through the United Nations is given in the future. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Scott, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And I'd like to begin by thanking my honourable friend for securing this debate and for his courtesy in sending me a copy of his remarks in advance. I know the situation of the residents of Camp Ashraf is important to him and many members of this House and also the other place, and I'd like to thank also other colleagues who are present who've made their contributions to the debate and expressed their concern. The recent incident, which my honourable friend has made the base of his speech, is a matter of great concern for the United Kingdom Government and others. The Government has closely followed events at Camp Ashraf for some time. Staff at our embassy in Baghdad have made consular visits to Camp Ashraf to inquire about the welfare of those who might be entitled to UK consular service or protection. The last of these visits to Camp Ashraf by embassy staff was on the 16th of March this year. We believe a small number of residents there have some connection to the UK, though none have yet come forward to request consular assistance. In addition to those consular visits, we do hold regular discussions with EU and US colleagues and with the government of Iraq about the situation at the camp. It is a situation that poses complex challenges, and as I'm sure honourable members appreciate, there are no easy answers to something that has lasted a long time and which is very far from clear-cut. The Iraqi government has a long-standing commitment to close the camp and has made this clear to the camp residents. Iraq's sovereignty extends across all its territory, and that includes Camp Ashraf. But along with our EU colleagues, we believe that using force is not the way to resolve the situation at the camp, and I shall speak more clearly about that in a moment. It is, however, the government of Iraq's responsibility to respect and protect the human rights of its residents. But let me outline, if I may, something about the nearly 3,500 residents of Camp Ashraf and the organisation to which they belong and why they're there. Camp Ashraf is controlled by the People's Mujahideen Organisation of Iran, or PMOI. The PMOI is, as I'm sure honourable members know, an Iranian opposition group with extreme leftist origins, founded in 1965. It's also known as the MEK. The PMOI is often referred to as the main opposition group to the Iranian regime, a view which it works vigorously to promote. The United Kingdom government, however, believes that the PMOI has little or no support within Iran and is not considered a legitimate opposition group by the Iranian people. Nor are we unable to forget its violent history. It was an organisation responsible for a number of serious terrorist attacks which led to the deaths of many Iranian civilians. The violent history of the organisation led to the PMOI being proscribed by the UK as a terrorist organisation. The government has strongly opposed its proscription on 2 occasions, first domestically in 2008 and then in the EU in January 2009. The organisation remains proscribed in the US. Nonetheless, whatever its history, our views and concerns over Camp Ashraf, the rights of its individual and the violence of the recent incidents are equally clear. My honourable friend has made the point very strongly that out of concern for the welfare of the residents at Camp Ashraf, the UN and the US should intervene and establish some form of presence there. But, as I'm sure he's aware, it was always clear that with the expiry of the UN Security Council resolution mandate at the end of 2008, responsibility for the security and administration of the camp and its residents would pass from the US to the government of Iraq. But before the handover took place, the US received assurances from the government of Iraq outlining its commitment to the humane treatment and continued well-being of the camp residents. We recognise that Iraq is now a sovereign democratic state and that the responsibility for the residents of Camp Ashraf lies with the Iraqi government. But we also expect Iraq to act in accordance with legal obligations. The UN makes weekly visits to the camp, has regular telephone contact with representatives of residents in the camp. The UN also holds weekly meetings with the government of Iraq's Ashraf Committee. We're aware there have been calls for the residents of Camp Ashraf to be considered as protected persons under the 4th Geneva Convention. However, this status only applies where there is an international armed conflict or situation of occupation under international humanitarian law. Neither scenario now applies to Iraq. This does not mean, however, that there is a legal vacuum. As I've said, Iraq is obliged to treat residents of the camp in accordance with Iraqi law and international human rights treaties to which it is a party. But turning to the events of the 7th and 8th of April, we and internationals have been and continue to be active in calling on the government of Iraq to stop the violence against residents of Camp Ashraf. My honourable friend was good enough to mention the statement that I made on that date, but I think it bears repeating and placing in Hansard, if I may, Mr. Scott. The UK government is disturbed to read reports that a number of civilian residents have been killed and many more wounded at Camp Ashraf yesterday. I absolutely applaud, this statement came out from me, I absolutely deplore any loss of life. My sincere condolences go out to the families of those involved. Can I get to the end of the statement and then respond to my honourable friend? The Iraqi government has provided us with assurances on several occasions that it will treat individual residents of Camp Ashraf in a humane manner, act in accordance with Iraqi law, the Iraqi constitution and its international obligations. We urge the Iraqi government to uphold this commitment. Our ambassador in Baghdad has been expressing our concerns to the Iraqi Ministry of Foreign Affairs at the highest level. We call on the Iraqi government to cease violent operations in Camp Ashraf immediately and to ensure that the residents have full access to medical care, meeting the point made by the honourable gentleman and a number of others. My statement goes on. It is important that the government of Iraq takes immediate steps to calm the situation and ensure that the human rights of residents are respected. We are aware of a request by UNAMI to send a humanitarian monitoring mission to Camp Ashraf as soon as possible. We fully support this request and therefore urge the Iraqi government to quickly grant permission. We call on all sides to engage in a constructive dialogue that can lead to a lasting resolution to the situation. That ends the statement I made on that day. Indeed.
I'm most grateful to my honourable friend, and thank you, Mr. Scott. I'm surprised to hear that the Foreign Office, in support of your statement, is continuing to argue totally against the findings of POAC, the Prescribed Organisations Appeal Court, when it dismissed the government's view at that time totally out of hand. So that surprises me, coming from a minister who I respect immensely. But may I make a further point? And that point is that for all the talk about international law, at the end of the day, Britain and other nations committed and made sacrifices to create this government in the expectation that the government would be democratic and free. We now know that they are not willing to uphold international law, and I believe that we ought to be doing much more than the Minister's statement suggests. And if I may say so, I believe secretly the Minister thinks that too.
Minister.
Mr Scott, I appreciate my honourable friend's comments. In relation to the first part of his remarks, I stand by the statement the Foreign Office makes, and which is our belief that the organisation's background and history and present activities require it to remain prescribed by the United Kingdom, and that is our view. But as I indicated very clearly, it doesn't matter about the history in relation to what is happening on the ground now, which is a matter of fundamental human rights. It's a matter of ensuring that people are treated properly and decently and there's proper access to medical care. And my honourable friend's injunctions and those of others are absolutely right, and we're seeking to uphold on that. That leads into the second part of his question, which is the difficult issue of how, when a sovereign government has been established, how it meets its obligations when it has that responsibility, and it's not the responsibility of those outside to do the things that are required to be done by a sovereign government. And it is a difficult process, but an absolutely necessary one, to get them to live up to the obligations which they've stated, and international partners have got to continue to make that clear. It is frustrating all round. And the circumstances of Camp Ashraf, the living conditions, must be extremely difficult. But it is a complex situation in which the history cannot be completely ignored, which is why I relate it. But the immediate issue in relation to the other week, on that our position has been clear, and I've stated what it is we did at the time and what we're attempting to do.
I know my honourable friend has got very little time.
I have, but go on.
I do say to my honourable friend that the position about the PMOI being a prescribed organisation is absolutely ridiculous, considering you only have to regard the way we deal with the Irish Republican Army to see how facile that position is. But I just want to say to my honourable friend, does he think the Foreign Office could facilitate a small group of British parliamentarians actually going to Camp Ashraf to see what the situation is at first hand? Minister.
I'm not going to answer that question directly, as clearly I need to take some advice in relation to colleagues' safety and background and everything else, and it wouldn't ultimately be a matter for us, it would be a matter for the sovereign government involved. But I hear what the Honourable Gentleman says, and let me take that back. If I can conclude in the time available to me. In addition to the statement which I've just read, deploring the loss of life and injury, EU High Representative Cathy Ashton did much the same. UK representatives on the ground reinforced the messages. The ambassador in Baghdad, EU heads of mission, met the Iraqi Prime Minister to discuss Camp Ashraf on the 4th of April. Our ambassador hosted a meeting with the UN, the US and the EU on the 7th of April to discuss those concerns. And he phoned the Iraqi Foreign Minister to urge the government of Iraq to allow immediate access for a UN mission to Camp Ashraf. And we also called for the violence from whatever source to stop immediately. So we've made our position as clear as we can. Latest reports, if I may, indicate that the situation in Camp Ashraf remains tense but calm. The government of Iraq allowed a small US medical team access to the camp on the 10th of April, and I understand that following international pressure in which we have been involved, the Iraqis have subsequently allowed medical access. A visit by UN officials took place on the 14th of April. Although the government of Iraq did not allow other missions to participate in the UN mission, a UK military advisor to the UN assistance missions to Iraq was present. The UN visited a makeshift mortuary within the camp and photographed 28 dead. Yesterday, the UN confirmed to our embassy officials that 34 were killed in the incident and over 70 injured. I repeat, our deploring of that situation. The current situation is of great concern to the UK. We remain fully engaged on the issue. We hope that UN missions, including the British Embassy, will also be allowed to visit Camp Ashraf to assess the situation in the near future. We'll continue to work with our international partners to